Greetings to my fellow peace blunderers, and today I'm telling you pretty much everything you need to know about the ultimate chess dilemma. Which piece is better, the bishop or the knight? It is honestly one of the most frequently asked questions by players from beginner to intermediate rating level range. But if you are intermediate and coming up to expert, advanced, whatever, bear with me. You still have a lot to learn from this video. And I've already covered a debate of similar magnitude, which is the queen against the two rooks. Check that video out. It'll be very insightful. Anyway, I'd like to start with the most obvious thing, and that is the bishop and the knight are both worth 3 points, according to the universally recognized material counting system. Now, there are opinions that the bishop is worth a teeny tiny bit more, something like 3.25, 3.15, depending on who you listen to. And what I'd like you to know at the end of the day is that both pieces have tremendous potential and both pieces can be crucial for you winning the game. It's just that their potential is of a very, very contrasting character, and it's up to you to shape your chess positions to maximize that potential. This opinion that the bishop is worth a little bit more than the knight comes from the fact that across thousands and millions of all the chess positions, all chess games that ever occurred, on average, a bishop has been more useful. So if you employ a purely statistical approach, then yeah, you might argue that, well, bishop is just slightly more valuable. But I feel that this way of thinking is just way too rigid. If you just take it at face value, the bishop is a bit stronger than the knight, and if you just start preferring the bishop to the knight in every one of your games, I don't think it's a very good idea, but we'll get to that. Yeah, since I've been talking about the bishop, let's first take a look at the bishop. Let's see what makes a good bishop, what makes a bad bishop, and what makes a position more suitable for the bishop than the knight. What you see in front of you is a very ridiculous, very extreme position, but it is there to make a point. Usually, bishops are considered quite bad if they are operating in tight spaces and they are blocked by the pawns of their own color. You see, bishops, as opposed to knights, are long-range pieces. If we place a bishop on, let's say, a8, it can reach as far as h1, provided there are no obstacles in the way. The knight, of course, is never able to do that. The maximum range that any knight at any time possesses is like 2 squares away, like so, or like so, or like so, or like so. You get the gist. And that is exactly why in the positions where we have the long-range sniping ability of the bishop blocked by the pawns of its own color, it's quite suboptimal. And in this quite sadistic position, although white is a pawn up, if you count white has got 5 pawns as opposed to black's 4 pawns, it doesn't really matter. The position is actually mate in 13. However, you've got to be very careful when assessing a bishop's strength purely based on its color and the color of the pawns. For example, we've all heard this, right? The bad bishop is the one that is the bishop where the pawns are. The good bishop is the bishop that is contrasting in its color with the pawns. So from that point of view, we could argue that the c4 bishop that white has got is the bad one, because it's a light squared bishop and all the pawns that white has got are on the light squares, apart from this one, but it doesn't really matter, does it? Whereas the c6 bishop that black has got is the good one, right? Because it's a line squared bishop and it is contrasting in color to the pawns that are all on the dark squares, again, apart from this one guy on h7. But in this position, the reality is actually quite the opposite. It is the c4 bishop that is the better bishop, because look at how many squares in black's own backyard it's controlling. It's looking over d5, e6, f7, and g8. And in that sense, the pawns on e4 and on f5 are kind of even helping to do that job of controlling these squares. At the same time, the nominally good bishop on c6 that black has got is staring at virtually nothing. This pawn on e4 is incredibly strong and solid simply because it cannot be possibly undermined anymore by the d pawn, and being undermined by the f pawn is also not looking very likely in the next couple of moves. Again, it's all about the issue of being blocked or not being blocked, and you can be blocked by your own pawns and you can be blocked by your opponent's pawns as well. One of the best things that arguably the black can do is to exchange that c6 bishop for the c4 bishop by something like bishop b7, bishop a6, right? Because otherwise, how do you develop that bishop? How do you make it better? Something like bishop e8, bishop h5, you could argue, oh, there's a little scope there, maybe attacking the c2 pawn at some point. Yeah, but this scope is very impractical. White has got a ton of pieces on the king side, like the queen, the two rooks that are defending all of these squares massively. All of the light squares are basically impregnable. And that is basically handling the bad bishop situation 101. You either trade it off for any other piece of equal value, a bishop or a knight, preferably the bishop, because usually when you have the bad bishop, the bishop of the same color that your opponent has is typically good. Or you try to manipulate the pawn chain in a way so that the pawns get forward and they're no longer blocking your bishop, making it better or even good. It's just that in this case, it is very hard to do for black. I can't really see how in the next 10 or even more moves, something happens to this pawn skeleton. It is very rigid. And that is why, as I've told you before, the bishops really thrive in open positions. And that is why such openings as the Danish Gambit exist, and they are pretty valid openings. For example, if you're unfamiliar with the Danish Gambit, it's a pretty fun opening. e4, e5, d4, e takes d4, sacrificing one pawn, not retaking with the queen, but rather playing c3, and after d takes c, we don't take the pawn still, we play bishop c4, developing a bishop, and after c takes b2, we finally take the dreaded black pawn, sacrificing two entire pawns, but getting both our bishops onto deadly diagonals. And the engine evaluation of this position, considering that we just lost 2 pawns, is quite generous. It's about -1. But again, it's -1 in theory. Practically speaking, when you're playing against a human, it's a bit harder to play for black. I would say it's less than -1. It's approaching equality. And of course, the open diagonals and the open positions don't just happen in the opening or in the middle game. I have a ridiculous position to show to you guys. The endgame position, where it's also very open and is just very funny. Look at this one. White has 4 extra pawns and the h pawn is very close to promotion, just 1 step away. However, because we have this magnificent bishop on b2 and because it is an open endgame with this diagonal not blocked by anything at all, the bishop is able to stop any pawn that comes onto the dark square. Any pawn that comes forward is going to get immediately captured. And this position is, of course, winning for black because we have 1 pawn, but bloody hell, what a pawn this is. A passer on a3 that is also very close to promotion. And the knight that is stationed all the way back on h1 is not going to be quick enough to stop us, even if we give white a move. Something like knight f2 is not going to help. We just play a2 and we reap our benefits. Knight d1, queens, and this is game over basically. And one important thing to note about this position is that the knight on h1, being situated in a corner, can only control and can only move to 2 squares. f2 and g3. That's all the knight can do. Not only is that a measly amount of squares, but also, of course, as I've alluded to earlier, very short range. Very short range the knight has got. The bishop, on the other hand, even if we put it on a1, still doesn't stop the bishop from controlling all of this diagonal in its entirety. And of course, the bishop is going to be technically better on a square like e5 than on e1, because on a1 it controls only 7 squares, these ones, 8 if you count the square itself where the bishop is, whereas on e5, if we put the bishop there, it's going to control this diagonal on top of that one that we were controlling before, so it's going to be not 7 squares, but 14. 14 squares, provided that the diagonals are open. 14! Okay, let's be fair. Fine. Let's remove e5 out of the equation, the square where we put mentally this bishop of ours. Let's just remove it out of the equation and let's just count all the squares apart from it. And we're going to get 14 minus 1, we're going to get 13. But still, check my math. But 13 is definitely bigger than 8, which is the maximum amount of squares that a knight can control. And since we started talking about the knight a little bit, let's switch our perspective and discuss the knight. Unsurprisingly, the knight is going to be the complete opposite of what the bishop is, and this position demonstrates it quite well. First of all, we've got the de facto bad bishop on f3, and in this position, it is quite bad, despite the fact that I told you that sometimes when the pawns are on the same squares, it doesn't automatically mean that the bishop is bad, but here, yeah, it's not looking very great. At the same time, the knight on c5, the black has got is absolutely majestic, and for a couple of reasons. First of all, since the bishop is good at open positions with open diagonals, it comes as no surprise that the knight is very good at positions that are closed, positions where the pawn structure is blocked up, and as we can see, a lot of the pawns are standing opposite each other and are blocking each other up. Secondly, the knight is attacking two massive weaknesses in white's position, and that is the pawn on b3 and the pawn on e4. The b3 pawn is the backwards pawn, which means that at no point later in the game can this pawn be protected by another pawn, unless somehow this pawn on b4 just magically disappears, and the pawn on a5 probably magically disappears, and this pawn can move forward enough so that it's supported by a4 and c4, but as it stands, it's looking very unlikely. And knights are absolutely brilliant at attacking backwards pawns. Every time you have a backwards pawn, always be careful about your opponent's knight, because they have this great ability of jumping over obstacles and disregarding them completely in blocked positions. The b3 pawn, the e4 pawn, it's really hard to see, let's say, the b3 pawn getting pressured by the black's queen, for example, anytime soon, because of where it is and because of the character of the position. How do you imagine the queen getting to the b3 pawn? Quite difficult. The knight, however, just doesn't care. Doesn't care about anything. It can very easily attack these weaknesses from the front, like so. And thirdly, something that I think people don't talk about enough is that when you have a knight against bishop positions, it's much more difficult to get rid of a good knight than it is to get rid of the good bishop. And what I mean by that is, look at this position. This knight on c5 is on a dark square. If you have only a light squared bishop as your last remaining minor piece, what are you supposed to do? This bishop will never be able to get rid of a knight that is sitting on that dark square and is sitting there forever. And the knights, on the other hand, are more flexible. They don't care what bishops you've got, a light squared bishop or a dark squared bishop. Knights change color every move they make. So it doesn't matter where you place your bishop, doesn't matter what color it is, chances are the knight can eventually get to it. And to continue focusing on the knight a little bit more, let's switch to this position. And let's discuss the strength of the knight. You see, the strength of the knight is a far bigger variable than the strength of the bishop. And what I mean by that is that it doesn't matter where the bishop is placed usually, unless it's completely blocked off, the bishop is still able to control a fair amount of squares. We saw the bishop on a7 controlling 7 squares, 8, if you want to put it in 8. A bishop in the center is going to control 13 squares, and yeah, usually the bishop, regardless of its placement, is going to control at least like 7 squares. The strength of the knight, however, is far more dependable on its placement on the board. And this is where we need to start thinking about ranks, right? So if a knight is placed, let's say, on the first rank, and this is usually your least desirable situation, these knights are considered defensive units. And don't get me wrong, sometimes the knights on the first rank are a necessity, and sometimes they are even a good necessity. A good knight on a1 or h1 even can protect some vital squares around the corner if you need to stay solid and defend. But I think it comes as no surprise that the knight on a1 or h1 is going to be far inferior than the bishop, again indicated by this position that we had, where the knight on h1 was just nothing. The knight on a second rank is still considered a bit more defensive than it is offensive, and is also inferior to the bishop in general terms. The knight on a third rank is now very close to bishop's value, if not equal, because the knight on a third rank is usually, when we think about the knights on c3, on f3, they already become these octopus knights that can watch over 8 squares and reaching their maximum potential. But the thing is, on the third rank, the knight isn't really attacking that much. Most of the 8 squares that we are controlling are in our own half. The knight on the fourth rank is now controlling more squares deeper into enemy's territory and is 100% equal to bishop's power, even maybe just a little bit, sometimes prevailing over the bishop. The knight on the fifth rank, as you can imagine, is even more dangerous, watching over some of the squares that we have on the 7th rank, on the 6th rank as well. On the 5th rank, the knight tends to be stronger than the bishop 100% as well. On the 6th rank, the knight reaches its maximum potential, and this is what you've got to memorize. The 6th rank is the best rank for your knights, and if you manage to get your knight in a position like you see in front of you, it is the perfect position. The knight is situated on a light square, and there are no bishops anywhere in this position, but this knight on a5, if it really wanted to exchange itself for this knight on e6, it will have to make a couple of moves to only get to that square, something like b7 or d8. But then again, we don't have to really exchange this knight for this knight. This knight on a5 is looking silly, but it's only looking silly for a very brief moment, because we can just place it on b3, and voila, we also have a very, very good knight for black. On the 6th rank, from black's perspective, just remember that when I talk about ranks, I talk about them from white's perspective, first, second, third, and fourth. You've got to mirror them if you're talking about black. Anyway, a protected knight, and these knights are now both protected, both are very strong. They control an amazing array of squares in your opponent's half. They tend to control 6 squares in your opponent's half, as I indicate right now. And these knights are considered to be far stronger than bishops, even maybe just about reaching the strength of a rook. And when it comes to the knight on the 7th and on the 8th ranks, then the strength of a knight diminishes because it's a bit too far. On the 7th rank, it's still very good, but maybe just a little bit stronger than the bishop, if not equal to the bishop. On the 8th rank, probably just about equal to the bishop, if not a little bit worse. And developing on this topic, I also want to talk about knight outposts. You see, these are absolutely critical for knight development. A knight outpost is basically a square where a knight can land without being blundered and being protected by a pawn. You see, bishops, because they're long-ranged pieces, they're not really reliant on outposts. If we imagine a bishop that is standing on c3 and staring at the g7 square, it doesn't really matter where along this diagonal the bishop is going to stand. If attacked, for example, by a pawn on b4 and threatened, the bishop can just retreat to b2 and still look over the g7 square. But if something threatens the knight and forces it to go away, the knight just simply cannot control the same square after it moves. Now, on e6, it looks at g7, and if we just imagine that the pawn isn't there and the knight isn't sufficiently defended and has to move, the knight would move to g5, and from there it cannot control the g7 square anymore. And that is exactly why the idea of a knight outpost is so important. Knights like to be very static. They like to take up just one brilliant square, preferably on the 6th rank, and just stay there. Stay there and apply pressure move after move after move. And again, this plays into knights' nature. They like blocked positions where almost nothing ever changes, where pieces stand on the same squares. They like to be static. They like to maneuver just a little bit sometimes around these obstacles, whereas the bishop, they like open positions, they like dynamism. They like exploiting open spaces and they like exploiting open diagonals. And the knight outposts are the best when the knights cannot get kicked out by either of the adjacent pawns. And what I mean by that is look at this knight on e6 for a second, because both the d pawn and the f pawn moved past the e6 square. The knight can no longer be dislodged by a pawn. The same thing is with the b3 knight. If we look at it, both a pawn and c pawn moved past the b3 square, and we have the same knight outpost of the same efficiency, the same strength. And we already saw how a bishop completely obliterated a knight in an endgame because it was a really open game with lots of open space. Let's take a look at the reverse example. Let's take a look at the extreme example of a blocked position and of a beautiful knight outpost, which is this position. Here we have everything that is good about the knight and everything that is bad about the bishop. We have the pawns on the same side, which is also a very important thing. You see, when comparing this position to this position, we had the pawns on different sides of the board. This pawn belonged to the queen side, and most of these pawns belonged to the king side. And when we have endgames with pawns on different sides, usually bishops tend to prevail. Logically so, because they are long ranged and they can easily switch back and forth. However, when we have positions that are blocked, again, that contain pawns on the same side, knights usually are better. We have an impressive knight outpost on the 5th rank. I'm looking at it from black's perspective. This is the 5th rank. And of course, since the e pawn and the g pawn moved past the f4 square, this knight outpost is at its best. The knight is undislodgeable. And the knight is on a dark square and the bishop is the light square, so the bishop will never be able to capture the knight as long as it stays in place. And the bishop is also not being helped by the fact that it is of the same color as the pawns of white. And yeah, this position is quite predictably absolutely hopeless for white. It's going to be a very easy win for black. The engine says it's -50. And one last very important thing I'd like to talk about is the opening factor. For example, if we look at this position, which is a very common King's Indian position, the Petrosian variation, at first glance, it may seem that this bishop on g7 is a very, very bad bishop that we are supposed to try and get rid of at all costs. After all, it is being blocked by our own pawns, and most of our pawns are situated on the dark squares in general. However, when you play a certain opening, it always has certain underlying ideas behind it, right? And If you play the King's Indian, for example, on the regular, you know that this bishop, albeit quite bad as it stands right now, you know that after an X amount of moves, it's supposed to become good. You're supposed to get this knight away, you're supposed to play f5, open the position up, and open up the diagonal so this bishop reaches its maximum potential. Another example comes from my personal experience. For instance, I like playing the Alekhine a lot, and in this position, if white plays h3, I very easily just take the knight on f3, and I'm fine with that. Queen takes f3, and actually bishop takes on f3 is the engine's best move, okay? And the reason behind this, again, you've got to know your openings. Technically, you could say, well, this position is quite open. I don't see much things blocked here. So I don't really understand why you're going against your own rules and you just give up the bishop pair in a position that, again, is not very blocked. You've got to know the opening ideas. In the Alekhine, you are happy to give this bishop away for the knight because the knight was controlling very crucial central squares. The e5 square and the d4 square. Now I play knight c6 and I put some nice pressure onto that d4 square, which not be very easy to do if the knight was still there. Lastly, for example, we have your Ruy-Lord pairs, e4, a5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, a6. Here some people like taking, which is a fine option, just takes on c6, d takes c6. And you could argue that this position is not closed by any means, quite open. It has all the potential to become even more open. But again, some people like just giving up the bishop pair because they believe that they have other kinds of compensation, namely the compromised pawn structure on the queen side that they're going to exploit. So what I'm trying to say is, when studying your openings, look into these imbalances as well. Look at what ideas, what setups are more preferable in the middle games that arise from the opening positions that you play. Do these positions favor bishops? Do these positions favor knights? You've got to study that. Sometimes these positions are not going to adhere to the common rules I've just explained to you, and that is just the beauty of chess. The exception proves the rule, and you've got to be flexible. So yeah, if you just so happens to find this video useful, please like and subscribe. Follow me on Twitch. I stream Wednesdays, Fridays, and Sundays. Find me on chess.com. Join our Discord, all that good stuff. And I'm going to talk to you very soon. My favorite unancestral gambiters. Love you all. See you in the next one.